Sejam muito bem-vindos no Simpósio Internacional Povos Indígenas, Natureza e Justiça. Evento realizado pelo Superior Tribunal de Justiça e a Associação dos Magistrados Brasileiros, com o apoio do Ministério dos Povos Indígenas e da Fundação Nacional dos Povos Indígenas, FUNAI, e patrocínio do Banco do Brasil. O principal objetivo do simpósio, sob a coordenação científica do senhor ministro Herman Benjamin, do Superior Tribunal de Justiça, é aprofundar o diálogo sobre os direitos dos povos originários e a necessidade de políticas públicas para a sua proteção. Nesse sentido, autoridades internacionais e nacionais dos três poderes estarão reunidas para tratar da agenda de promoção e proteção dos direitos essenciais da população indígena. Informamos que os certificados serão emitidos por sistema eletrônico, mediante o registro da frequência mínima de 75%. O registro da frequência pode ser feito por meio do QR Code do evento. Para os novos participantes presenciais, as inscrições podem ser realizadas no balcão de entrada. Integram a mesa de abertura deste simpósio Suas Excelências, a senhora Presidente do Supremo Tribunal Federal e do Conselho Nacional de Justiça, ministra Rosa Weber, a senhora Presidente do Superior Tribunal de Justiça e do Conselho da Justiça Federal, ministra Maria Tereza de Assis Moura, o senhor Ministro do Superior Tribunal de Justiça e coordenador científico deste simpósio, Herman Benjamin, a Presidente da Comissão da Amazônia e dos Povos Originários e Tradicionais, deputada federal Célia Chacriabá, o Presidente da Associação dos Magistrados Brasileiros, juiz Frederico Mendes Júnior, o fotógrafo, o senhor Sebastião Salgado, e a diretora jurídica do Banco do Brasil, doutora Lucinéia Possar. Registramos também a presença da desembargadora federal Germana de Oliveira Moraes, vice-presidenta do TRF da 5ª Região, e do deputado federal Túlio Gadelha. Para seu pronunciamento e abertura deste simpósio internacional, com a palavra a senhora ministra presidente Maria Tereza de Assis Moura.
Antes de iniciar as minhas palavras, eu pediria a todos que, em posição de respeito, façam 1 minuto de silêncio em memória do ministro Paulo de Tarso Sanseverino, ministro integrante do Superior Tribunal de Justiça, e que faleceu em Porto Alegre no último dia 8 de março. Peço, então, que todos fiquem em pé. Boa tarde a todos e a todas. Eu gostaria de cumprimentar inicialmente os integrantes desta mesa de honra, ministra Rosa Weber, presidente do Supremo Tribunal Federal, meu colega de Superior Tribunal de Justiça, ministro Herman Benjamin, que é o coordenador científico desse simpósio, a deputada federal Célia Chacriabá, o presidente da AMB, juiz Frederico Mendes Júnior, o fotógrafo Sebastião Salgado, que brinda a todos nós com sua presença nesse simpósio, a diretora jurídica do Banco do Brasil, a doutora Lucinéia Possar. Eu saúdo igualmente Suas Excelências ministras e ministros do Superior Tribunal de Justiça, aqui já vislumbro o ministro Sebastião Reis Júnior. Eu saúdo também o senhor embaixador Sean Roy, da Irlanda, na pessoa de quem permitam-me cumprimento as embaixadoras e os embaixadores e demais representantes do corpo diplomático que prestigiam este evento. Ministros e ministras dos tribunais superiores, senhoras e senhores parlamentares, integrantes do Ministério Público, advogadas, advogados, demais autoridades do Poder Judiciário, Legislativo e Executivo aqui presente, senhores especialistas brasileiros e estrangeiros, moderadores e conferencistas deste simpósio, inclusive da Corte Interamericana de Direitos Humanos e de Cortes Supremas de outros países, eu agradeço por honrarem com sua participação. Eu cumprimento também os profissionais da imprensa, os estudantes, servidores e colaboradores do Superior Tribunal de Justiça, do Conselho da Justiça Federal, todos aqui presentes. É com imensa satisfação que dou as boas-vindas aos presentes nesse simpósio internacional Povos Indígenas, Natureza e Justiça. O debate acerca dos temas de interesse contemporâneo se reveste de especial importância para o aprimoramento das políticas públicas, além de contribuir para a busca da excelência da prestação jurisdicional. A iniciativa do STJ de aprofundar o diálogo dos direitos dos povos originários e o Estado Democrático de Direito na busca da solução de conflitos envolvendo a cultura e a própria sobrevivência da população indígena insere-se na missão constitucional da Corte Cidadã. Afinal, a prestação jurisdicional só será efetiva, de um lado, se partir da compreensão dos riscos enfrentados pelos povos indígenas quanto à sobrevivência própria de seus saberes e de sua cultura, e, de outro, se for salvaguardada a posse de suas terras, não só na Amazônia Legal, como também nas demais áreas ainda à espera de demarcação. Para além disso, a valorização dos diferentes povos que habitam nosso país e o respeito a eles incumbe a todos nós, cidadãos, pois as tradições desses povos são fonte importante de aprendizado cultural e histórico. Não à toa, a temática está integrada ao Objetivo de Desenvolvimento Sustentável número 11 da Agenda 2030, que visa, entre outras ações, intensificar esforços para proteger e salvaguardar o patrimônio cultural e natural do mundo. Este simpósio, realizado em conjunto com a Associação dos Magistrados Brasileiros, apoio do Ministério dos Povos Indígenas e da Fundação Nacional dos Povos Indígenas e patrocínio do Banco do Brasil, tem por especial objetivo o aprofundamento do diálogo sobre o desenvolvimento e o aprimoramento das políticas públicas destinadas à proteção dos direitos dos povos originários. Participarão do evento ilustres conferencistas, membros dos 3 poderes da República e autoridades internacionais com capacidade de decisão sobre a agenda de promoção e proteção dos direitos essenciais da população indígena. Os painéis trarão ao debate a perspectiva indígena no contexto do Estado de Direito. Serão ainda objeto de aprofundamento problemas que permeiam o direito internacional e a perspectiva do sistema interamericano de direitos humanos. Não é demais lembrar, a propósito, que a Corte Interamericana de Direitos Humanos, reunida em sessão realizada neste tribunal em agosto do ano passado, ouviu testemunhas em conflito travado entre populações indígenas e o Estado do Equador. Eu anuncio também, com muita alegria, que, concomitantemente a este simpósio, o Superior Tribunal de Justiça tem a honra de sediar a exposição Povos Indígenas, Natureza e Justiça, do fotógrafo Sebastião Salgado, cuja abertura a ser realizada nesta data será exclusiva para participantes presenciais deste evento. E eu aproveito para convidar senhores e senhoras a participarem dessa homenagem à população tradicional, cuja preservação e valorização incumbe a cada um de nós. Estendo o convite a todos que não puderem prestigiar a exposição no dia de hoje, para que o façam amanhã, data em que a exposição será reservada também com exclusividade a quem participar deste simpósio. Neste contexto, eu estou certa de que este evento promoverá riquíssima troca de experiências entre os participantes e deixará como legado a toda a sociedade o incentivo à conscientização sobre a necessidade de respeito à diversidade cultural tão cara ao nosso país e a cada um de nós. Eu desejo a todos um profícuo simpósio. Obrigada.
Convidamos, neste momento, a senhora ministra presidente Rosa Weber para proferir suas palavras.
Uma boa tarde a todas e todos. Cumprimento a minha querida amiga, ministra Maria Tereza de Assis Moura, presidente deste Tribunal da Cidadania, e, na pessoa de Sua Excelência, peço licença para cumprimentar todas as autoridades integrantes da mesa, todas as autoridades já nominadas e todos os presentes a este evento, inclusive de forma virtual. É com grande alegria que testemunho, neste Superior Tribunal de Justiça, um novo encontro do direito com a primorosa arte de Sebastião Salgado, em cenário mais amplo, em que todos nós, membros da comunidade jurídica e artistas, voltamos nosso olhar para as relevantíssimas questões dos povos indígenas e da preservação da natureza. E falo de reencontro porque, como é sabido, o acervo cultural do Supremo Tribunal Federal conta com 18 painéis fotográficos de Sebastião Salgado, integrantes do projeto Amazônia, doados por ele e por sua esposa, Lélia Salgado, na gestão da ministra Carmen Lúcia. Os expressivos painéis, em preto e branco, que ocupam diferentes ambientes do edifício sede da nossa Suprema Corte, retratam povos originários de diversas etnias, como os Yanomamis, os Camaiurás, os Corubos e os Macuxis, além da biodiversidade da Amazônia. Privilegiados, portanto, os que no Supremo Tribunal Federal têm a enriquecedora oportunidade de contemplar tais painéis diuturnamente, em constante diálogo com a questão indígena ou da preservação da floresta e da própria condição humana. Não raras vezes, tais reflexões espelham o pareamento entre expressão artística e questões jurídicas de alta indagação, em uma época em que do trabalho dos tribunais se espera a resolução, inclusive proativa, de temas sociais delicados, cuja conflituosidade costuma ser exposta pelos artistas com a sensibilidade que lhes é própria. Arte e direito complementam-se na luta pela construção de um mundo mais justo e solidário. E tal mensagem é tanto mais urgente quanto sabemos que, marcados os dias ainda recentes por ataques e retrocessos, tanto contra a justiça como contra a questão indígena e o próprio meio ambiente. Como disse o poeta russo Alexander Pushkin, há dois tipos de obscuridade. Uma vem da falta de sentimentos e pensamentos, que são substituídos por palavras, e outra que vem da abundância de sentimentos e pensamentos e da consequente inadequação das palavras em exprimi-los. Esta segunda hipótese, creio, é a do espanto positivo diante da obra de arte, em face da qual emudecemos pela dificuldade de traduzir em discurso o impacto da sua expressividade em nosso âmago, em nossa alma. A primeira, que deriva da ausência, é, ao contrário, a obscuridade maléfica, destrutiva, desprovida de significado valoroso, que equivale à ignorância, sobre a qual já me referi como um mal que nada reconhece, nada respeita, nada provê e se volta, como algoz, em seu vazio substancial, até contra os que buscam iluminá-la, uma vez contaminada pelo discurso vazio, que decorre da irracionalidade, do preconceito ou de uma infértil visão hermética do mundo. Essa obscuridade maléfica deu sinais de recrudescimento em datas recentes, repito. Basta lembrar as invasões de garimpeiros, grileiros e madeireiros em terras indígenas demarcadas em Roraima e a grave crise humanitária que atingiu o povo Yanomami. E ainda, focado o olhar na justiça, amanhã, 18 de abril, completar-se-ão 100 dias desde o infame 8 de janeiro, quando o edifício sede do Supremo Tribunal Federal foi vítima de barbárie. Tenho manifestado convicção de que existe um liame entre tais ocorrências aparentemente díspares, porque o Poder Judiciário, ao instrumentalizar a prevalência da autoridade da Constituição cidadã como norte da atuação jurisdicional, naturalmente se erige em barreira a toda sorte de pretensões ilegítimas que, assim contrariadas, reagem manifestando inconformismo com a posição de destaque assumida pelos tribunais no constitucionalismo contemporâneo como lugar de salvaguarda de direitos fundamentais, de proteção das minorias e do pluralismo. Apenas como exemplo dessa atuação jurisdicional que venho de referir, e com base em situações recentes de sistemática ofensa aos direitos indígenas assegurados pela Constituição, cito as decisões do Supremo Tribunal Federal na DPF 991, sob a relatoria do ministro Edson Fachin, em que determinada a apresentação de plano de ação por parte da União para a proteção integral dos territórios com presença de povos indígenas isolados e de recente contato, diante das generalizadas violações de direitos humanos ocorridas em um quadro de insuficiência da ação protetiva estatal. E na DPF 709, sob a relatoria do ministro Luiz Roberto Barroso, quando suspensos atos administrativos da FUNAI que desautorizaram atividades de proteção territorial em terras indígenas não homologadas. Pois bem, desse mesmo substrato, onde gerada a obscuridade maléfica e gananciosa do garimpo ilegal e de atividades criminosas semelhantes, praticadas em desrespeito aos direitos constitucionais dos povos originários, resulta igualmente a paralela ignorância dos que confundem o valor imaterial da justiça, que norteia a atuação jurisdicional, com as instalações físicas, o prédio, a argamassa e os bens materiais de um tribunal. Tal erro de percepção poderia ser evitado, inclusive, a partir da educação dos sentidos pela arte, em face de tudo o que de sublime, em termos de sensibilidade e padrão civilizatório, o espírito humano se torna capaz de inferir, a partir dela, a arte. Como disse o próprio Sebastião Salgado, em frase que acompanha a exposição de algum de seus painéis no Espaço Cultural Ministro Menezes Direito, no Supremo Tribunal Federal, o acesso de todos a uma cultura sofisticada é a expressão da suprema democracia. Entretanto, os que lá estiveram em 8 de janeiro, imbuídos de despropósito antidemocrático, destruíram, inclusive, objetos de grande valor artístico. Até um dos painéis fotográficos de Sebastião Salgado, quando tanto bem teriam feito ao país e a si próprios se tivessem limitado a admirá-los. Passados esses 99 dias, restam-me 3 certezas. A de que as instituições republicanas brasileiras se sagraram vencedoras, sustentadas pelo incontável apreço de nosso povo pela democracia constitucional. A de que incumbe ao judiciário trabalhar no fomento de sua memória institucional para que ataques de tal natureza, no caso, o único ao longo de todo o Império e dos 132 anos do Supremo Tribunal Federal na República, jamais seja esquecido, como condição para que não se repita. E a da relevância do uso pelo Judiciário do instrumental concedido pelas técnicas inerentes à teoria constitucionalista contemporânea, como lugar de discussão e resolução de conflitos sensíveis, assim como de estabelecimento das políticas públicas necessárias às normas constitucionais e a concessão a tais normas da devida efetividade, mormente em face dos grupos minoritários e vulneráveis, historicamente tratados com notório desprestígio no que diz com sua proteção institucional. Assim, só posso louvar a realização deste simpósio com escorreita formatação, como não poderia esperar de outra forma, tendo como organizador o nosso querido ministro Herman. Simpósio esse a conjugar cultura e direito, dando visibilidade à questão indígena e à natureza no âmbito das comemorações do mês de abril. Sensibilizar corações e mentes e viabilizar caminhos jurídicos de tutela efetiva nos termos da nossa Constituição Cidadã de 1988, são medidas que se complementam de modo orgânico para que a interação das mudanças individuais e sociais de que necessitamos enquanto povo e nação, que se quer grande e o é, inclusive pela diversidade cultural que abriga. Tenhamos todos um excelente e produtivo simpósio. Muito obrigada.
Registramos que integra a mesa de abertura desse simpósio, Sua Excelência, a senhora Ministra de Estado do Meio Ambiente e Mudança do Clima, Marina Silva, a quem passamos a palavra para seu pronunciamento.
Boa tarde a todos e a todas. Primeiro, eu quero agradecer a honra desse convite e cumprimento de um modo muito especial a nossa ministra Rosa Weber, presidente do Supremo Tribunal Federal e do Conselho Nacional de Justiça. É uma honra para todos nós tê-la como nossa presidente. Quero cumprimentar também a ministra Maria Tereza Assis Moura, que fez a delicadeza de me fazer o convite pessoalmente, que é nossa presidente do Superior Tribunal de Justiça e do Conselho de Justiça. Meu querido amigo ministro Herman, é uma alegria compartilhar essa mesa com você, Herman, deputado federal, nossa querida deputada federal Célia Chacriabá, nós temos a felicidade de poder celebrar, estou vendo o deputado Túlio Gadelha aqui na minha frente, meu companheiro de partido da Rede Sustentabilidade, mas nós temos a alegria de termos, na história do Brasil, a eleição de 3 mulheres indígenas em 500 anos de história, mais de 500 anos. E temos a pioneira, nossa querida Joênia Apixana, a nossa ministra, hoje ministra dos povos indígenas, Soninha Guajajara, e a Célia. Então, celebremos essa conquista que também é de todas nós, mulheres. O juiz federal Frederico Mendes Júnior, presidente da Associação dos Magistrados Brasileiros. Quero cumprimentar também o querido Sebastião Salgado, nosso grande fotógrafo das imagens, não é, que revelam a alma e o coração do Brasil, e a doutora tratar de temas como o que está sendo tratado nesse simpósio. Eu sei o quanto é caro a cada um de nós que lidamos com a agenda socioambiental e dos direitos indígenas, os temas que muitas vezes não são considerados de maioria no imaginário da sociedade brasileira. Esses que vão fazendo uma mudança de natureza muito mais que legal, muito mais que apenas a letra fria da lei, mas elas vão mudando nos espaços estruturais, não apenas aqueles que vão fazendo a arquitetura física da sociedade, mas, sobretudo, a sua arquitetura cultural, e que vai possibilitando internalizar em nós e em cada um de nós, ou pelo menos deixar de recalcar em nós e em cada um de nós aquilo que são as nossas raízes mais profundas. E as nossas raízes mais profundas têm a ver com o povo preto desse país, tem a ver com o povo indígena desse país, que tem uma tecnologia que deve ser muito bem olhada e aprendida pela sociedade ocidental, não é? Que, infelizmente, os ocupou, infelizmente, em grande parte, os eliminou ou tentou assimilar. Ainda bem, não é, que essa tecnologia da resistência e de como vencer a morte continua presente em quase 1 milhão de indígenas no nosso país, na variedade de línguas, na variedade de povos. Durante o período difícil de ameaça concreta à nossa democracia que vivemos, tivemos, em meio à pandemia, manifestações muito contundentes de defesa da democracia e do Estado de Direito, feita pelos empresários, feita pelos cientistas, por aqueles que eram considerados o elo mais frágil da nossa sociedade, se deslocaram de seus territórios e fizeram esse enfrentamento concreto, trazendo seus corpos, trazendo sua imagem, trazendo sua voz para dizer que, mesmo em momentos de dupla ameaça da vida com a pandemia e da democracia com uma visão autoritária, eles se faziam presente. Não há nada mais forte, mais potente do que quando comparece aqueles que são os fiéis depositários dessa raiz mais profunda, os nossos povos originários. E é muito bom, eu parabenizo aqui mais uma vez, que, mais do que ter pessoas falando sobre o povo indígena, o que é bom para o povo indígena, como devem ser as leis e as políticas públicas para os povos indígenas, que a gente tenha legisladores indígenas, formuladores indígenas, executores
and policymakers, and executors of indigenous public policy. So with those words, I'd like to say that President Lula has as a priority in his government 3 fundamental pillars to strengthen democracy, because without democracy, it's much harder for us to be able to find solutions for the big problems that exist. The intelligence of a few, no matter how brilliant they are, cannot replace the intelligence of all. And democracy makes it possible for the intelligence and competence and activity of all to take place. Another pillar is the fight against inequalities. There is no democracy and democratic state of law if we live in a situation of extreme inequality for those who are most vulnerable and the most vulnerabilized. It is fundamental to fight against inequality. And the third pillar is the search for a development model that is sustainable. It's sustainable in its various dimensions. Sustainability is not just a way of doing things, it's a way of being. It's a vision of the world that needs to be present in all its dimensions, the economic one, the social one, the environmental one, the cultural one, political, ethical, and even aesthetic. And with those words, I would like to thank you here for allowing me to participate and to join these men and women that are so courageous and relevant for the history of our country. Thank you.
At this time, His Excellency Justice Herman Benjamin has the floor. Well, my name is formally not on the program. Yes, it is, Justice. Well, I have not seen it. I did not see it. At any rate, I think your name is on the official version, Chief Justice. Well, thank you very much for that piece of information. At any rate, I believe that both Justice Rosa Weber as well as Justice Maria Teresa and just now Minister Marina Silva and all of those who will be speaking in the opening session of this symposium have already indicated just how important this event is. It is the first time that the Superior Court of Justice gets together to discuss the rights of indigenous peoples. Although on a weekly basis, virtually, we do examine and issue rulings on the lawsuits involving indigenous peoples. On the second point, which I will derive from the remarks made by those 3 speakers who spoke before me, is about the fact that in Brazil we have this phrase. I mean, ambassadors, Madam Ambassadors are probably familiar with this phrase, as well as members of the diplomatic corps. We have the following phrase: that which the eyes do not see, one's heart will not feel. And I think it is therefore important for us to juggle Sebastião Salgado's art with the rights of those who are not hundreds of kilometers away, but rather thousands of kilometers away from the decision-making powers and centers of power, and who work to protect not only the physical space, but also the original cosmology or the world vision that is in one way or another with us, even if we do not know about it. And that is what the law is for. The law and rights are aimed at drawing closer ties between and among people, and do so through art, not only through the code, ink on paper of the law, as Minister Marina mentioned. And we, judges, should, from a legal perspective, understand that we are called upon to protect the rights of these peoples, not because we may wish it or so want, but rather because the federal constitution and the laws so determine. A judge who fails to understand that will not be in compliance, nor will he be fully respecting the Constitution and the laws. And quite certainly, he or she will not be able to pass proper rulings, nor will he be properly judged by the future generations. So I wish to thank you all and congratulate you all for this effort. I wish to thank photographer Salgado, Sebastião Salgado, Lélia, and family members for being with us. Those of us members of the bench are not so boring. I think it's better to say it in Spanish, aburridos. We're not so boring. We are professionals. Yes, we are legal practitioners, but we also do have a sense of artistic sensitivity. So with that, may I say that you are all most welcome. And Madam President, allow me to voice special thanks to the Superior Court staff. We're talking about hundreds of professionals who, I see many of them here actually, including Carlos Schmidt, through whom I would like to convey my extensive thanks on my behalf and also on behalf of Justice Sebastião Reis, who happens to be a photographer, by the way, in his free time. He is our, say, in-house staff and staff member and photographer as well. So I would like to thank Carlos Schmidt and his entire team, as I wish you all a very fruitful and wonderful event. And so many of us are judges here today, and I wish that we be able to mainstream and incorporate all of this body of knowledge to feed into our rulings and trials, as well as any litigations involving indigenous peoples. Thank you very much, Madam President. At this time, Congresswoman Célia Chacriabá has the floor.
Rena, 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 na re na simikra hikiwa simikra hikiwa simikra ahikiwa nandangri apanki nandangu minishan nangoni sex.
Greetings in my indigenous tongue. Future justice will be either ancestral or it will not be. Justice shall be either ancestral or it shall not be. I wish to thank all of my family members and relatives, because this is how Justice Rosa Weber last year, and by the way, I'm very moved to be on this side of the table, because even last year and in 2021, as part of the compelling mobilizations amidst a pandemic, we spent more than 30 days camped out here in Brasilia, and we would spend days and nights here at the free land, because we know one's right is what you have to assert for yourself, otherwise we would die. We would either die from COVID-19 or would die from sheer violence perpetrated against us. I wish to say, Madam Justice, that this is a very timely moment, because we're supposed to thank, because if we don't thank, if we're not grateful for what we are, only with difficulty we will be able to celebrate what we will have. I'm saying this because oftentimes people are looking for different ways of life or different means of livelihood throughout the planet. And one is called upon to decide whether one will live or die. And the indigenous peoples in this country show quite clearly just how important it is to take care of the rights of indigenous peoples all over the world. And I said that, tribal chiefs can cure, the shamans can cure, but I believe that that the law can also help us heal and help us say, as indigenous peoples, that we are not afraid of justice. We are afraid of injustice. We have no problems with differences, but we have a problem with situations where differences become a frontier and a barrier and a reason for us to be murdered. Minister Marina Silva has been a constant co-worker. She has been a warrior with us all, especially those of us working in the Ministry of Regional and Traditional Peoples, we wish to affirm that all biomes are relevant. I am indigenous people from the Cerrados, the Brazilian neotropical savannas, the oldest biome in the history of humankind. We also have Mr. Moraes, who works with Minister Marina Silva. He is the Secretary for Traditional and Original Peoples. And 4 years of absence in the past administration, but we have nevertheless served as permanent ministers of the environment, because the only reason why Brazil did not lose its high-profile position internationally is because we were able to uphold our presence, and it is right there on the ground. I also wish to thank Justice Herman as we stand and resist. This is a rather different celebration today. Also, our friend and colleague, Dr. Lucine, we wish to thank you all and say just how thankful we are to Banco do Brasil, because the bank has helped us bring the indigenous people to the very center of the discussion agenda. Justice Frederico, as well as our colleague from the state of Minas Gerais, Sebastião Salgado, the photographer, who has also helped us reforest territories. And just like us, indigenous women, he has helped us reforest minds and hearts to help heal the planet. 2021 was marked by one of the largest mobilizations. We also had, of course, the trial and sentences issued on the past time frame for demarcation of indigenous lands. Kleber Carapibe, who is not here today, but he is part of one of the most important law firms in Brazil. He attended, or he went to law school, yes, but he also went to other very practical places where we were waging the battle. He was a major teacher who taught us many lessons. And the oldest minister in the history of humankind are women. And the oldest minister who has taught us so many lessons is Mother Earth. And on April 24th, we will be relaunching our parliamentarian work front. Congressman Tulu is also a member of that work front, the congressional work front, which has proved very important. We've worked together with Congresswoman Joina Apshan. It's taken more than 30 years ever since the very first indigenous congressman was elected, Juruna, before the 1988 federal constitution. And as part of this congressional work front, we're opening up a new chapter. And on April 24th, we will be holding a solemn session. And Marina Silva, you will remember, because back then you were a member of Congress, and we will occupy the main plenary of the National Congress with more than 300 indigenous people. In the past, we occupied the plenary session to go against the proposal of establishing a past time frame for land demarcation. And justices attending the session and other colleagues, oftentimes we are asked, are indigenous people primitive as a people? I often say, what about mining? Isn't mining primitive as well? It erodes mountains. We wish to reforest, we wish to indigenize, and we wish to bring more women on board. And we are also active members of the Climate Observatory together with Congressman Nito Tato. He's about to travel to Chile, and I think it is important to underscore the importance of the Indigenous April celebrations in Brazil. And also Justice Maria Teresa and Justice Rosa Weber and Minister Marina Silva. April 19th will celebrate 16 years ever since the indigenous man Galdino was murdered in Brasilia. When he came to Brasilia to take part in a protest, he was asleep on a public bench in a square in Brasilia, and he was murdered by sons of members of the judiciary. And that brutal murder took place. And when they were asked, why did you murder the indigenous man who was just lying and asleep? The murderers answered, well, I thought he was just a beggar. The fire that killed that brother has not been extinguished. It remains alive. And in 523 years of struggle, as we know, Minister of Indigenous People Sonia Guajajara is now in New York attending an important conference. A new ministry, yes, but it is an ancestral ministry because Brazil started with us. We were here before anyone else. It's taken 255 years for FUNAI, the National Indigenous Affairs Foundation, to be led by an indigenous woman, as well as other leaders such as Samara, Ipataxaw sister, who has exerted an important voice on our behalf. The three different branches, executive, judiciary, and legislative branches of power, there's more to the three branches. There's a fourth branch of power, which are us, those of us who are actively involved out there on the ground. And we must act not only through judicial means, but also through our ancestral means. We need many indigenous lawyers and attorneys, such as Leroy Terena, because we can resort to these important ancestral resources. DPL 79 was an important contribution by the Electoral Court of Justice in the recent past, especially during COVID. As an essential activity, Congress tried to pass that Bill of Law number 191 on mining. They tried to open up indigenous lands to mining activity as if it were an essential activity. It is not. So only with strong determination have we been able to withstand and resist. And the Superior Court of Justice has been very important for us. In the recent past, as you all remember, people wanted to allow everything to go through and trample on our rights. Our indigenous relatives may say, well, it takes a lot of money. It is very expensive to demarcate our territories. We used to be less than 1%. Today we are 1.5%, but we account for 5% of the world's population, and we protect more than 80% of the social and biodiversity out there. So it's not that there's that much land for a few indigenous people. If people are really worried about the economy, together with Congressman Gadele, among other colleagues in Congress, if you really are concerned about the economy, the fact is that there will probably not even be money out there for you to spend if there is no planet. And all of the environmental savanna and Amazonian region issues should be addressed not only as a progressive agenda. After all, if you do not become sensitive by the crimes perpetrated against the Yanomami girls and the rapes against the Yanomami young girls, I want to ask you, how much does it cost for you to expropriate the lands? How much does it cost for you to expropriate our lands and protect the forests and resources? I think more questions have to be asked, which is how much will it cost us if the heavens above us are no longer above us? You will no longer have land to set your foot on. I often see that humankind is growing increasingly cold, but we have an important challenge, the challenge of lower the temperature of planet Earth to warm up our hearts. What is the time required for justice? How long does it take? Consider Dawn and Bruno, who were murdered in the Amazon region last year. Brazil still ranks among those countries that have most killed human rights advocates and defenders of indigenous rights. We have traveled throughout the country and we have exposed the ecocide and ethnocide, but there's also what you might describe as crimes against love, because when you fell a tree, when you cut a tree, you're really losing your ability to love as a member of humankind. I think those of us who are indigenous peoples, we should not be frustrated if it doesn't work within 4 or 5 years. Although we do have certain emergencies, such as, for example, fighting the violence against us. But consider, how long does it take for you to plant a tree? Some trees need 10 years, 50, 100 years to mature. And my father often says that he had to build a house before he could have a watch. But when he gained a watch, he lost time. And he says, what good does a watch serve if we're losing so much time? People are so eager and so anguished because they are looking at their watches because they have so much to do after they finish what they're doing now. And I often say that the right for indigenous rights and the fight against deforestation, the right or the struggle for deforestation or the struggle against deforestation for the planet will be a real struggle when we no longer fight against time, but rather when we fight to resume time. Today, the wealthiest people on the planet are not those who have money, but rather those who have time on their side. And we believe that as indigenous people, we should enjoy food not only to feel full and good, but rather to resume our relations with Mother Earth. In Congress, and in conclusion, may I say that we have engaged in strong battles. Some 15 days ago, we saw the majority or a majority of the House pass provisional measure Executive Order 1150, which provided for more flexible conditions governing deforestation along the Atlantic forest. On the same day, Executive Order 1151 intended to sell the right to pollute through the carbon market. I believe we must establish a real commitment, because if people are truly committed, we need to have a Congress that is indeed concerned about the planet. I often say we have a shadow parliament that is actually concerned about the planet. Bill of Law for 240, including provisions on the applicability of the past time frame governing the demarcation of indigenous lands. So we are focusing efforts on the three different branches of power. And in conclusion, may I say that, oftentimes when we go places, we are asked, what are you going to do? Wearing those headdresses. You're not even 1% of the Brazilian population. Well, altogether worldwide, we are about 5%, but we protect more than 80% of the planet. We are a minority, yes, but we are the very best of humankind, because according to UN data, demarcation of indigenous lands is the #1 solution to stop the climate crisis. And when we fight for our territories, that's because we know that when you have a territory, you have a place to go back to as a home. You have the cozy reception and welcoming arms to welcome you. I'm not sure whether we should call this country Brazil or Pindorama in Tupi, in the Tupi language. Many people ask themselves, what should you do if you are an indigenous or a Black person? These are aggressive questions, because the white supremacy plan was really an ambush. Many languages were killed off, and as part of this ambush plan, foreigners get special treatment. But we women ask ourselves, what kind of right can be uprooted if not established? In Brazil, I've seen women being raped. I've seen indigenous people like Gaudino being murdered, but our spiritual strength is what upholds our very existence. Very often, the constitutional proposed amendment 2015 was discussed, but we resisted with our ancestral force, in the force of paintings and pigments. For many years, women were limited to the kitchen, but we today are actively involved in culture because we resist. Before the Brazil marked by crowns, there was the indigenous Brazil marked by our headdresses.
Ouviremos agora o senhor juiz.
We will now listen to Judge Frederico Mendes Jr. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a great honor to be able to participate in this event and in this solemn address. I would like to start by greeting Justice Rosa Weber, President of the Supreme Court and leader of the Brazilian Magistrates, and reaffirm once again, Justice, the support of the Brazilian Magistrates to your actions in defense of the democratic rule of law. I would like to read our host, Justice Maria Teresa de Assis Moura. I would also like to reaffirm all my consideration and all the respect of the Brazilian magistrates for STJ. I would like to greet Justice Herman, on behalf of whom I greet the entire panel and members present here today. Today, we will be addressing a matter that is essential not just for Brazil, but for the entire world. I told Minister Herman a while ago that last week I met the Justice of Portugal that represents a great part of the magistrates of the world. His name is Igreja. And I told him about Minister Benjamin, and he said, well, he is also a reference here in Europe. So on behalf of the entire plenary, I would like to congratulate Minister Benjamin. He has worked extensively on the recognition of human rights and this extremely important framework for the promotion of human rights in the country, recognizing the dignity of human beings as the basis of the Republic. And as it cannot be otherwise, the Constitution of the Republic is an important mark of defense of the rights of Indigenous peoples. Whenever there are any doubts, all you have to do is look at the Constitution and know that the rights of Indigenous peoples need to be protected. In fact, the Brazilian state has the obligation of protecting Indigenous peoples, but also their culture and territorial rights, considering that the context in which Indigenous peoples exist carries historically a great stigma of being marginalized and excluded. Justice needs to be wary in order to guarantee and promote the rights of these peoples. In this sense, I would like to echo the words of Justice Luis Fux when presiding the Justice Council. He said that a modern judiciary power open to the population that is proud of doing justice must ensure dialogue between cultures, respecting the way of being and living of Indigenous peoples. We can happily say that we are advancing on this matter. As such, I would like to refer to Justice Rosa Weber, who in a recent mission with Indigenous communities of Amazonas announced that in this first semester, she will launch the process to discuss the past time framework for the demarcation of Indigenous lands, a topic that the Minister for Indigenous Peoples, Sonia Guajajara, said is one of the priorities of the current administration. As the minister affirmed in her discourse when she took office as minister, she said that Indigenous peoples exist in different ways, but mostly not as many history books portray them. Evidently, in a context of great plurality and diversity, it cannot be allowed for stigma to be in any way reinforced or advanced, particularly in or by the judiciary power. It is certain that the rights of Indigenous peoples need to be a constant concern of the judiciary branch. And in that sense, I can state that the Brazilian magistrates are very concerned with this, so much so that recently AMB, through the Judiciary Studies Center, established a partnership with IDP, the Getúlio Vargas Foundations, Jus Brasil, and UNDP in order to finalize decisions of STJ in relation to the rights of Indigenous peoples in the period of 2000 to 2023. Despite the results of this work, we have to reinforce the fact that the rights of Indigenous peoples requires the recognition also by the judiciary power of the fact that it's not just important, but also necessary to ensure the active construction of an inclusive society that promotes human rights and mutual respect. I would like also to extend my special congratulations to photographer Sebastião Salgado, one of the most renowned photographers of the world and journalists, who will, after this event, provide us with a wonderful exposition of his photographs. In that sense, I would like to wish you all a very fruitful event so that we can deepen the issue of Indigenous rights and the need to protect them. Thank you. And now we give the floor to Mr. Sebastião Salgado. I'm sorry, I didn't know I had to speak. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. My wife, Lélia, and me fought extensively, especially during the pandemic, to protect Indigenous communities. We organized a manifest that was signed by 67 great personalities of the entire world. We occupied a space in the biggest Brazilian newspapers to bring the three branches of power together: the executive power, the judiciary power, and the legislative power. But the legislative power did not respond. Lost in themselves, they did not answer. And if that wasn't enough, we were attacked by the judiciary power. Today, at FUNAI with Jurema, we received once again a group of pictures that had been removed from FUNAI. This had been a donation that we had made to FUNAI in the prior government. So these pictures, thanks to a prosecutor called Eliana Torellia, and I'm sorry, I'm a bit old, and I sometimes forget. I'm 80 years old. But thanks to her, the photographs were kept safely, and they have recently been returned to FUNAI. So from the executive branch, nothing but attacks. Even though our manifesto wasn't directed to the executive branch only. But after this, the judiciary branch responded with a wonderful response. Justice Toffoli was presiding in the court at the time, and together we fought for the rights of indigenous peoples that were being threatened by COVID. Everyone knew that indigenous peoples had no antibodies against diseases coming from outside the forest, with a huge possibility of being destroyed. And we were able, thanks to the actions of the Supreme Court, to make sure that the indigenous peoples were the first ones to be vaccinated when the vaccines arrived. So I'd like to thank you from the judiciary branch. I know that most of the people who are here today are part of the judiciary. So I would like to thank you for the responses that you made. You are true allies in the fight for the indigenous cause and for everything of what is fair in this country. This morning, we left São Paulo, took a taxi, and went to the airport of Congonhas to come to Brasilia. And while driving through the streets, I saw millions of people thrown away, sleeping on the streets, without a home, without a toilet to go to, without food, basically thrown in the garbage. Something terrible. Hundreds of thousands of Brazilians are living like that in the city of São Paulo, in the city of Rio de Janeiro, in most of the cities in Brazil. But who are they? Who are these Brazilians? 30 or 40 years ago, those people were small landholders. Agriculture at the time was made of small landholdings. At the time of low inflation, the Brazilian financial system supported many large landholders, and they started buying lands. And with all the economic situation, they ended up losing their lands, and that ended up as simple workers, totally unprotected by the law, without a labor contract, and that had to step in a bus to go to the fields to work. And when the work was done, the truck didn't come back, and they weren't taken home, and they had no work. And then everything changed, and now we have agribusiness, high-tech agribusiness, that Brazil is very proud of, but ended up benefiting only a couple of rich landowners, while at the same time, thousands of people lost their jobs in order for them to become rich. So it's a huge injustice in Brazil, and this injustice spreads everywhere in Brazil. It's on the streets. And with an agrarian reform, things would have been very different. We would have adopted an agricultural model hundreds of times better for Brazil, including all Brazilians. And I'm saying this because this almost happened to indigenous peoples as well. If we think of the past time frame, the invasion of indigenous lands for mining, or the exploitation of minerals, all of this is part of an attempt to take over indigenous lands. Now, thanks to an organization that may even be the most important one of the country, of this of the country, called FUNAI, little more than 25% of the Amazonian territory belongs to indigenous peoples and is protected by the Constitution. And you, judges, prosecutors, lawyers, the Brazilian judiciary power protects them because they are protected by the Constitution. And the attempt of the prior government was to violate that right of indigenous peoples, invading their lands. And do you know why? I know the Amazon like the palm of my hand. I went to the Amazon 58 times, 58 missions in 9 years, working with indigenous communities, working with the Brazilian army, traveling by boat in the Amazon. I know the Amazon. We can divide the Amazon in 3 big spaces. 1, indigenous lands protected by the Constitution. 2, another huge Brazilian entity, which is the Ministry of Environment, through IBAMA, protected 24.9% of the Amazonian space in conservation units. Half of the Amazon is protected by the Brazilian Constitution. This is serious. And the other half of the Amazonian territory are barren lands. These abandoned lands were the main target for invaders. We lost close to 18.5% of the territory of the Amazon, and today they are rural properties. Pay attention, they have occupied almost all of those lands that were adequate for agriculture, because of the rest of the port are Igapó forests that are taken over by water 6 months per year and cannot be used for any type of agricultural project in the long term. So what is left of the Amazon for agriculture? Indigenous lands, because they were the first ones to arrive They are part of the Homo sapiens that entered Americans millions of lands ago when there were no human beings here yet. In the last glacier period, the Bering Strait transformed into a bridge that froze over. And during thousands of years, indigenous, actually Asian people started entering America and reached the Amazon. And they're the ones that are still in the Amazon. And in fact, it's not them, it's us. We're all part of the same species. But part of us, from a European origin, arrived 500 years ago, while indigenous peoples arrived 200,000 years ago. And when agriculturals reached the Amazon, what do you think they did? They chose agriculturable lands, highlands, not invaded by waters. And these are the lands that the aggressive agribusiness wants. That is why we are trying to create a past time frame to steal the lands from indigenous peoples. That's why I ask the judiciary to protect these lands, because these indigenous peoples do not have economic power, they do not have military power, but they are the true guardians of the forest. If you take a map of the Amazon and look at indigenous territories, they are the best protected lands of the Amazon. They are possibly the biggest cultural contribution of the planet, 180 languages and cultures, a sophistication that you cannot imagine, an incredible wealth. And inside the Amazon forest of Brazil, there are close to 102 groups that have never been contacted at all. They live like we used to live 10,000 years ago. They are the prehistory of mankind. It's of an incredible richness to think that we in Brasilia right now, in the 21st century, with all the technology we have, live side by side with our prehistory that is living right at this precise moment inside the Amazon. So I think that all of us Brazilians have the obligation to protect the Amazon space, to protect the planet's greatest biodiversity reserve, to protect the greatest water reserves of the planet. A large part of the rainfall system of the planet starts in the Amazon, the only space on the planet capable of generating moisture, because all the rainfall outside of the Amazon space comes from evaporation from the sea. But that's not the case for us. We have a forest in which big trees are able to put in the air close to 1,200 liters of water each. So we create an airborne water flow. The amount of water that leaves the Amazon through the air is greater than the amount that the Amazon River goes into the ocean every day. So for a planet that is undergoing global warming and a lack of water, this space, my friends, is the planet's greatest wealth. And indigenous communities are the biggest protectors of that space. Working together, we will not just be protecting the Amazon or the indigenous communities, we will be protecting the future generations of Brazilians. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you. We would like to register the presence in the auditorium with the President of the National Foundation of Indigenous Peoples, Dr. Joênia Wapichana. We now give the floor to Dr. Lucineia Possar. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here representing the Bank of Brazil in this International Symposium. I would like to extend special greetings to Justice Rosa Weber, President of the Supreme Court Brazil, our host, Justice Maria Teresa Sigimora, President of the Superior Court of Justice, and also greet Justice Herman Benjamin as the scientific coordinator of this great international symposium. And through your excellencies, I would like to greet all of the members of the panel and also of the audience. I would like to greet the authorities present here and also those who are watching us online. As being the last to speak, I will be brief. Justice Maria Teresa, anyone could ask, what is a bank doing in an international event about indigenous peoples, nature, and justice? But that question makes sense for those who don't know the Bank of Brazil. And the Bank of Brazil is a bank, but it is also culture, it is nature. The Bank of Brazil is cooperation, it is justice. In the end, the Bank of Brazil is society. And the Bank of Brazil is culture when it honors the work of an artist of the magnitude of our dear photographer, Sebastião Salgado, whose relationship with indigenous peoples dispenses any type of comments. The Bank of Brazil is also nature when it finances projects that preserve different ecosystems. The Bank of Brazil is cooperation when its foundation supports thousands of projects in all the corners of the country. And the Bank of Brazil is society when it brings together positive results for its shareholders, and here I include the National Treasury, but it is also present where others don't want to be. And there you will find the Bank of Brazil, Congresswoman Célia Chacriabá, meeting the needs of populations traditionally excluded. And Your Excellency mentioned the poor, Black people, indigenous peoples, and so many segments of our society. And since we are in a house of justice in the court of citizenship, I cannot but say, Justice Maria Teresa, that the Bank of Brazil is also justice. And I could refer to many examples of cooperation with the justice system, but I would just like to call attention briefly to a technical cooperation agreement that we will be signing with the Superior Court of Justice in the coming days for the use of artificial intelligence resources, analytical intelligence, to judicialize, to reduce the number of lawsuits that are being analyzed by the Brazilian courts respecting the jurisprudence already consolidated in our courts. Because of all that and more, the Bank of Brazil can be present in the most diverse spaces of Brazilian society. Minister Marina Silva, it can be. And that is because its contribution comes from long ago. We're speaking of 214 years helping to build an increasingly better Brazil. Congratulations for this event. Congratulations to the organizers of the symposium. Success, and thank you very much. At this moment, to conduct the tribute that will be made to artist Lélio Salgado, we will listen to the scientific coordinator of the symposium, Herman Benjamin. All right, yes, I am supposed to be here in this part of the program. When Justice Maria Teresa idealized this event and asked me to help out in the scientific aspect, I felt at home. But right away she said, if possible, I would like you to have an exposition of Sebastião Salgado. And I corrected her immediately. Sebastião Salgado and Lélia. And here I will use the words of Lélia herself. Quote, "The books are mine, the pictures are his." And now, as a judge, I would like to expand her interpretation. The books are mine, the expositions are also mine, and the pictures are his. And Justice Maria Teresa immediately agreed that we needed to pay tribute to this wonderful artist that is behind everything, but also ahead of everything, because we see that the photographs are his, but the art and the organization are hers. However, the most important thing is to say that we have been friends for many years, and the most important project of the family is the restoration of the farm that we visited, my family and I. We spent Christmas there without their present. They weren't there. And it was her idea. The efforts are joint. The results are for all of us, Brazilians, that might eventually doubt that it is possible to conduct forest restoration. We do not intend to imitate nature or to replace nature. We cannot forget the importance of preserving what we have, because tropical forests cannot be brought back. So I would like to ask this dear friend and artist, to whom Brazil and the world owe so much, and Indigenous peoples in particular, that she come here up front to receive a tribute. And Marina. So I would like to ask the Congresswoman, Minister Marina Silva, and Justice Rosa Weber, and Justice Maria Teresa to stand together and to read the plaque to us. On behalf of the male and female magistrates of Brazil, we express our gratitude to Lélia Salgado for her untiable fight in favor of Indigenous peoples and the most vulnerable population, that the beauty of her art inspires the work of Brazilian justice. Brasilia, 17 April 2023. I don't know whether I deserve it, but I feel absolutely honored. Thank you. I promise to continue giving my life for this cause.
Como eu disse, eu estou absolutamente homenageada e maravilhada com com essa homenagem que me fazem.
Microphone, please. I am in awe with this tribute, and I'm extremely pleased. Very happy to be here with you all. Microphone, please. And yes, I think we should all believe in our people, because the indigenous people can help us move forward. Today, we went to the Indigenous Affairs Foundation, FUNAI, and it's a wonderful place. And I think we should all strongly believe that Brazil can become a great nation again, a nation that does take care of its people. And together, I believe we will indeed be able to take this country to its rightful place. Thank you very much.
Agradecemos.
We wish to thank all of the government officials attending this session, with which we bring to a close this opening panel. We will start the symposium in a few minutes.
Organizar as contas é tão mais fácil com Minhas Finanças. Como eles pensaram nisso? Como que a gente pode dar mais ferramentas para quem tá lá usando o app do bebê?
Já sei. E se desse para organizar os gastos
constitucional
por categorias?
Que o governo federal lança o decreto de fomento à cultura, que vai garantir maior eficiência na gestão cultural. A partir de agora, o fomento será adaptado à lógica dos projetos culturais, ganhando maior eficiência e transparência na administração dos recursos públicos.
A cultura é capaz
de transformar os artistas e agentes para a gestão governamental e para os brasileiros que têm garantido seu direito à cultura. Uma iniciativa que vai apoiar e valorizar a cultura e a arte brasileiras, com mais democratização, descentralização e diversidade, fazendo com que as leis Rouanet, Paulo Gustavo e Aldir Blanc contribuam cada vez mais para o resgate dos nossos valores e da nossa identidade. É o reconhecimento para quem trabalha e vive pela arte, ajudando a fazer um país melhor. Brasil, União e Reconstrução, Governo Federal.
Organizar as contas é tão mais fácil com Minhas Finanças. Como eles pensaram nisso? Como que a gente pode dar mais ferramentas para quem tá lá usando o app do bebê?
Já sei. E se desse para organizar os gastos por categorias? Tipo o nosso convite.
E ainda ver os extratos de todos os bancos num só lugar.
A gente criou Minhas Finanças para você descobrir como é fácil organizar sua vida. Descubra Minhas Finanças no app do bebê.
A cultura é capaz de transformar vidas. É prática que ecoa a cidadania, a inclusão, a democracia. É potência criativa que faz pensar, agir e se orgulhar. A cultura é motor que faz crescer a economia e fortalecer o social. É espelho de um Brasil vivo e diverso. É manifestação que não se pode deixar de alimentar. É com essa convicção e ciente de que cultura também é um direito constitucional que o governo federal lança o decreto de fomento à cultura, que vai garantir maior eficiência na gestão cultural. A partir de agora, o fomento será adaptado à lógica dos projetos culturais, ganhando maior eficiência e transparência na administração dos recursos públicos, o que é bom para os artistas e agentes, para a gestão governamental e para os brasileiros que têm garantido seu direito à cultura. Uma iniciativa que vai apoiar e valorizar a cultura e a arte brasileiras, com mais democratização, descentralização e diversidade, fazendo com que as leis Rouanet, Paulo Gustavo e Aldir Blanc contribuam cada vez mais para o resgate dos nossos valores e da nossa identidade. É o reconhecimento para quem trabalha e vive pela arte.
Será que é? Posso perguntar um ali que estava na mesa. Indígenas, Natureza e Justiça compõe este painel que tratará do tema Povos Indígenas e Estado de Direito, Suas Excelências. Como moderadora, a senhora presidente do Superior Tribunal de Justiça do Conselho da Justiça Federal, ministra Maria Tereza, e na qualidade de conferencistas, a senhora ministra de Estado do Meio Ambiente e Mudança do Clima, Marina Silva, e a senhora presidente da Fundação Nacional dos Povos Indígenas, doutora Joênia Wapchana. Com a palavra, a senhora ministra presidente Maria Tereza de Assis Moura.
Agora, boa noite a todos e a todas. Nós vamos dar sequência agora com o tema Povos Indígenas e Estado de Direito. Nós teremos a participação de duas palestrantes que farão as suas falas. Eu pediria que utilizassem um tempo de 20 minutos cada uma, para que nós possamos, em seguida, dar sequência com a abertura da exposição. Eu vou passar, em primeiro lugar, a palavra à doutora Joênia Wapchana, é a primeira mulher indígena a presidir a FUNAI, ex-deputada federal, foi a primeira mulher indígena eleita para esse cargo no Brasil pelo estado de Roraima, formada em Direito pela Universidade Federal de Roraima em 1997, atuou no Conselho Indígena de Roraima ao longo de 22 anos no Departamento Jurídico. Também foi a primeira presidente da Comissão Nacional dos Direitos dos Povos Indígenas da OAB, em 2013, e de 2013 a 2015, conselheira do Fundo Voluntário da ONU para Povos Indígenas. Em 2019, foi agraciada com a medalha Mirtz Gomes de Campos, concedida pela OAB. Em dezembro de 2018, ganhou o Prêmio de Direitos Humanos da ONU, um dos mais importantes do mundo. Desde o início de sua gestão na FUNAI, a atuação de Joênia foi pautada por um movimento de reestruturação, aliado ao enfrentamento à situação emergencial do povo Yanomami, a retomada dos processos de demarcação e o diálogo com as lideranças indígenas. Eu passo, então, a palavra para a doutora Joênia, pedindo, então, que utilize o tempo de 20 minutos.
Para iniciar, eu creio que a introdução, a apresentação que a ministra Maria Tereza já fez, ela ilustra bem os desafios que nós temos enquanto povos indígenas, enquanto executivo, enquanto legislativo e judiciário. Uma palavrinha que se chama reestruturação.
And microphone, please. And that, in turn, will lead us to think of other factors and efforts such as reconstruction, participation, and above all, the need to engage in a dialogue with the indigenous peoples to meet a number of requirements and issues that were ground to a halt for many years. That is the current challenge at FUNAI, the National Indigenous Affairs Foundation. The month of April is a month where we celebrate the indigenous people, but it's also time for dialogue and for awareness building of the Brazilian state apparatus regarding indigenous peoples. And for quite some time, we have seen that all of the demands and food for thought we often get in April have become more and more constant issues on our agenda. I have been working at the National Indigenous Affairs Foundations for about 2 months, 2 days, and from day one, We have advocated greater involvement of the indigenous peoples within the executive branch of power, and we have called upon ourselves to meet these demands as members of the indigenous movement, and also more formally as we take on places that were up until recently closed to indigenous peoples. As my own track record indicates, we have held important positions in the indigenous movement, such as attorneys and the lawyers. Today, being an indigenous lawyer is not really a novelty. Thank God we have had increasing access to the university circles and have enabled indigenous professionals to defend our causes. We also have advisory services provided to the ministry by our dear friend Sanlara Patashaw at the Electoral Court, STE, and also at the legislative branch of power, as we just heard a few minutes ago from our dear member of Congress, Shakriaba. I've myself had that experience working alone in Congress, and today we see that in the executive branch of power, our involvement is limited not only to the FUNAI Foundation, but also includes the indigenous or the Ministry for Indigenous and Original Peoples through Minister Guajajara. And the next step is perhaps the judiciary branch of power. And our next challenge consists in having a Chief Justice, why not a woman justice, at the Supreme Court. I'm saying this because we are working towards increasingly active involvement of the Brazilian society in decision-making and that is the nature of indigenous peoples. We wish to share our values, our principles, our needs. If, on the one hand, in the past, we were trying to educate people on these principles and values, and also educate people on the need to regularize indigenous peoples as a strategy to conserve the environment and biodiversity, and also the waterheads and water springs, to strike a balance that will enable us to face up to the current crisis by materializing indigenous rights. At the same time, and on the other hand, we are also feeding into public policy design so as to provide guidance to the decision-making powers and the powers that be in this country. So from this perspective, it is a strategic effort. Whenever we take on a position in government, we are also establishing a strategy to protect the human rights of indigenous peoples, and as a consequence, by way of consequence and by extension, to all of the population planet-wide. When we talk about nature, we are led to think about our relationship and our strategy to expand our relationship with nature as best possible, so that other people understand that environmental and territorial management plans are relevant. And when you move from drafting a plan towards implementing the plan, that's also part of your strategy. And it is something that we now embrace in the executive branch of power as we execute or implement these policies. I often say playfully, Madam Justice Benjamin, that last year when I coordinated the Congressional Commission that looked into the status of the Yanomami people, when we passed the report back in November at the Federal House of Representatives, I was the chairperson, and we passed a number of recommendations issued to the Brazilian state apparatus, judiciary, executive, all received recommendations to see and understand situations involving the breach of indigenous rights. If those situations were attended to at that time, given their urgency and pressing need, maybe the scandalous death and murder of indigenous children would not have reached the high numbers it has. Many of the deaths due to malnutrition and food insecurity, which is a situation we have yet to overcome, as well as situations involving malaria and epidemics that could certainly have been overcome had arrangements being immediately implemented at that point in time. So I often playfully say that, yes, I did give recommendations, and I am now being called upon to fulfill and implement those recommendations. So I see myself in a situation where I myself issued recommendations to now be implemented by my team. So it is one thing to be in the indigenous movement, asserting your rights and claiming your stakes, but it is a different task to be on the other side of the table, drafting legislation to be executed by the executive branch of power in practice. So yes, I believe that the strategies that we have espoused as part of our trajectory in the indigenous people's history, I think it is fair to say that the strategy is by nature very dynamic, because we try to seek out strategies and alternatives to find solutions to the problems, and that includes not only the environmental issue, but also, of course, the need to bring to the table our views whenever we, for example, request our or assert our right to free, informed consent, and also when we address development projects in indigenous lands, and also our right to be or not to be impacted by business projects, the right to be heard, the right to protect our domicile, because indigenous lands are, by definition, the place of residence, the domicile of indigenous lands. No one, of course, would be willing to find your place of residence being trampled upon or interfered. And the same is true regarding indigenous peoples and our relations with the land we inhabit. We also wish to assert our rights to make decisions and actively take part in decision-making arrangements and mechanisms, especially when we find ourselves before situations that are often novel. The panel before talked about the economic challenge we currently face as a result of the current economic crisis, and we see people starving out there. We have experienced a number of different crises, not only the economic crisis, but also a civil rights crisis, the climate crisis. Everyone is interested in the climate crisis. When we indigenous people say we are interested in taking part in these discussions, that's because we too are being affected by these crises, and we wish to voice our views. That is why it is also important to give indigenous people a space and a voice so that we can hear their strategies, their plans as part and parcel of Brazilian society. The fact that we are gathered here today to talk about justice, an agenda which has increasingly mobilized our attention, because access to justice is about rights, ultimately speaking. So that too must be mainstreamed into the issues which we will address at the judiciary. We are now about to demonstrate the unconstitutional nature of the arguments involving the so-called marco temporal, in other words, the past time frame governing the demarcation of indigenous lands and eligibility thereto. FUNAI, the foundation, has a number of lawsuits and court rulings to be fulfilled. Very often, we only see the organizations or institutions' name, but institutions involve people. We don't want many of these cases to be filed away. Today, we find ourselves involved in an effort to re-establish the effort, and we are utterly interested in ensuring that indigenous lands be fully regularized and free of any caveats or reservations. We want the indigenous lands to be delivered and made available to the indigenous lands. So we wish to move on and make progress in the demarcation of indigenous lands. But we must, of course, overcome a number of hurdles, one of which is the legal hurdle, especially as regards this absurd argument of a past time frame that should otherwise apply as a required precedent, as opposed to the traditional occupation of indigenous lands. The Constitution, in our view, is actually very clear when reference is made to the original rights over the lands that are traditionally occupied by indigenous lands. Those are not subject to statutes of limitations. They cannot possibly be alienated nor transferred. And I think progress must be made. There has been an increase in the conflicts involving indigenous lands, many conflicts, many deaths as a result. And there's very little we can do, because today, FUNAI, the National Indigenous Affairs Foundation, is trying to uplift itself from years upon years of dismantling and persecution against government officials. That is a bottleneck we must overcome, because it serves no purpose to say that indigenous peoples are entitled to demarcation or allocate resources to that end if you do not really have people out on the ground to inspect and enforce their rights over their land. Working groups are established, but not always urgent court rulings are enforced, especially if you don't have enough government officials and civil servants to enforce their institutional duties. So this bottleneck we're experiencing today, we should be very strategic in addressing this bottleneck. And the strategy should be about describing the reality and giving it visibility to everyone in the country. Because I think this is a shared responsibility, not only by the executive, but also between the executive, the legislative and judiciary branches of power, and all of us, members of civil society and citizens at large. I think we should exercise the same sense of responsibility towards indigenous lands and the collective heritage of indigenous lands. So I think we should all be aware of these bottlenecks, demands, and challenges, and see them as a shared responsibility, a shared agenda, not only in the hands of the FUNAI civil servants, but all other powers that be, different branches of power. I also believe that we must attach greater value to the positive actions which we are trying to show and which can be taken on a day-to-day basis. May I also congratulate the Salgado family, the Salgados here, photographer Sebastião. They were at the foundation earlier today, and they have been working on this agenda for years. And we have the photographer and the publisher, and I thought to myself, well, we now need the indigenous person, who was willing to offer his or her image, so it's a tripartite relationship here, the photographer, the publisher, and also those who are being photographed as subjects of the photographer's lenses. I think we should show just how rich Brazil is in terms of cultural health and heritage, rich in terms of diversity of its peoples, 274 different languages, public heritage to be protected, amounting to about 14% of publicly owned, federally owned lands, but which are under the possession of indigenous peoples, a high percentage in the Amazonian region. And Minister Marina, no matter how much we may exercise our responsibility over the resources, considering the planet and also considering Brazil, over the past few years, there has been a lot of land grabbing and a lot of dismantling of our rights. But despite all of this, indigenous lands have been protected, even more protected than conservation units, because you have a physical presence of indigenous people living there who have given their lives to ensure a proper protection of our assets and our heritage, a heritage that will ultimately accrue to the benefit of everyone, especially as we preserve the standing forest and the water springs. Today, if you consider, for example, the current situation of the Yanomami people, and by the way, I am from the northern state of Roraima, for those of you who do not know me, and the indigenous peoples in Roraima are launching an appeal to ensure that the current contamination by mercury in the rivers of the region not be allowed to kill more people. And that is, of course, a challenge we all face, myself, Minister Marina, and also Brazilian society. After all, it is everyone's responsibility when it comes to asserting the rights and seeking out justice for indigenous peoples. So again, thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you so much, and congratulations on this symposium on indigenous peoples, nature, and justice. I think we are all making progress little by little. And as Sebastião Salgado aptly called to mind, we must attach greater value to indigenous lands by means of photography, for example. Other people have given their contributions by means of articles, by means of court rulings and decisions, and also through journalistic work. Thank you so much, and long live the indigenous peoples.
Eu agradeço a palavra da doutora Joênia.
I would like to thank Dr. Joênia for her words.
Todos os nossos compromissos, né, com os povos originários.
All the commitments that we have with autochthonous peoples are more than an obligation. They are something that we all must do because it is the right thing to do. So I would now like to give the floor to Minister Marina Silva. You all know her. She is a professor, environmentalist, and Brazilian politician, graduated in history with a specialization in psychopedagogy and psychoanalysis, doctor honoris causa by the Federal University of Bahia and by the Chinese Academy of Silviculture. She received countless national and international awards. She was a politician at many levels, always elected with record numbers. She was Minister of Environment and also ran for president. She was elected a federal deputy for São Paulo and is currently once again the Minister of Environment and Climate Change. You have the floor, Minister Marina Silva. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, I would like to say that I am tremendously pleased in being able to participate in this symposium. Greeting now particularly my dear colleagues in Fights and in Peace, Joênia Wapichana. I have to say that it's very good for Brazil and for indigenous peoples to have such a competent congresswoman such as Joênia with wonderful results in her participation in the Congress ahead of this job. Well, we are here to discuss the rule of law and indigenous peoples, nature and justice. I have to say, Justice Maria Teresa, that it is a great responsibility to speak about a subject like this one when we have Joênia, a lawyer, beside me, you yourself, Justice Herman, and the President of the Supreme Court, Justice Rosa Weber, and all of you. However, I'd like to say that the idea of a democratic rule of law is something that starts from many positions with many different viewpoints. Lawyers have one view, anthropologists another one, economists even another one, even more so. So as a history professor and environmentalist and politician, and also as someone that many people don't know is extremely interested in psychoanalysis, I am going to bring you a bit of that mix of my environmental activism with all those other regards. And in relation to that vision, we must take into account that we have with us Sebastião Salgado and Lélia Salgado that are able to cross the soul with their powerful lenses. Well, I think that to speak about the rule of law and thinking also of the perspective of indigenous peoples involves seeing that in the first place, the law for those communities and how it materializes for autochthonous peoples, traditional peoples especially. It will never happen if it's done in a fragmented, compartmentalized manner. It will be always and necessarily a cross-cutting action that includes justice, that includes makers, guiding justice, and there is also the place for public policies and culture and of the social imaginary. So democratic rule of law for part of our society that looks at things differently, that has a way of being in this world that is different, involves a complexity that we are sometimes not able to reach, because it's in the depths of the mind. Like Celia said, it has to do with the identity and existence between the human being and the territory, the space of its identity. There was a time when the filling of a hydropower reservoir was going to be filled, and this reservoir lied right above an indigenous community that was almost extinct. Very few people still composed that tribe, and very few people spoke the language. During that debate 20 or 30 years ago, many people said, how is it possible that we are considering not producing energy of I don't know how many megawatts because of a people that consists of maybe 6 individuals? And I tried to argument together with Suplicy. We were part of the Frontline Commission, and people didn't understand, except for very few people such as Pedro Simon, Arthur da Távola, people with a special expanded sensitivity. And then at a certain moment in a conversation with a number of people, I said, well, the place where the water will go and cover everything is what they identify as the place where the world was created. That is the space of their cosmovision, of their identity, the way that they perceive themselves in the world. But no one understood. And I said, all of us here are holders of the legacy of the Judeo-Christian cosmovision, in addition to the Greek influence, which is also extremely strong in all of us. Our cosmovision is Judeo-Christian. Well, just imagine if someone decided that they were going to demolish the wall of Lamentations to build a condominium that was going to receive tons of people to live there. The response would have, well, that's absurd. And I think that it's really strange that the point of reference regarding our cosmovision worldwide, regardless of whether we believe it or not, if anyone were to say something against it, people would rise and complain. But if we're speaking about our autochthonous people, well, who cares whether it's going to be covered with water? Who cares if they're going to be looking for oil or planting soy? That's also called the democratic state of law. But thinking of it differently, our ability to put ourselves in someone else's position, not only that someone else was close to us, those who we understand as being almost part of ourselves, but thinking of that other unique individual that is radically different, that enjoys things differently than us, that thinks differently, and that feels at risk, and that feels that prosperity is something totally different. And I think that many people have a lot of difficulty understanding that other people might enjoy life differently, that what they consider pleasurable is differently. And indigenous peoples enjoy life differently. They enjoy having a river filled with fish. They enjoy seeing the vegetation full of animals so that they can hunt to eat whenever they want, not to put in the freezer. Their enjoyment comes from having a fertile land to plant bananas and manioc so that they can live according to what they feel is prosperity. Right now, coming back from China, a congressman of a certain age said to me, Senator, how can you explain so much land to be available for so many people, for so few indigenous peoples, rather? Because that person was interested in knowing how others see this, and I tried to explain. And that amount of land needs to be there so they can develop their culture, their way of living, their science, their unique way of being in this world. And that is why our federal constitution of 1988 ensures the rights of indigenous peoples in its Article 67 that addresses the demarcation of indigenous lands. And it's funny to see that the Constitution and the original constituents, not the derivative legislators that took the Constitution and tried to deform it, but rather the original proposers of our Constitution. They established that starting in 1986 or the Constitution of 1988, the land should be demarcated no later than by 1988. And this was never done. And we have a huge deficit of demarcated indigenous lands. But when we think about the marco temporal, the time frame, they want to say that they have the right of demarcating those lands that had already been studied to be demarcated until the Constitution was instituted, that only those could be indigenous. And if it ended there, if until then they had not been studied, then they would no longer have the right. Now, we constantly have bills speaking about land regularization, and they always regularize lands that had been occupied by 2009 until a short while ago. And so they conducted the regularization until 2009. And now, from now on, we zero everything. And no other land will be demarcated. And that's what they say. But once again, the discussion has come up to regularize lands in which until 2014 and 2018, for people that arrived in the lands until 2014, 2018. However, those who have lived here for hundreds of thousands of years have no rights. And those who just entered those lands keep on extending the deadline so that can have the rights to their lands, including indigenous lands like Raposa Terra do Sol, where Joênia Wapichana went there to do a wonderful job defending the demarcation in continuous lands, not in islands, because they wanted to demarcate those lands in islands in Raposa Terra do Sol without making it possible for cultural and biodiversity to actually be extended from end to end. Why? Because they wanted to have access to the lands that they had recently taken over, destroying the culture of hundreds of years to save a way of life that could take place anywhere in the world. But the peoples of Raposa Terra do Sol should only be able to live right in that place. That place is for them a unique piece of the world. So it's important for us to think of the rule of law, the democratic rule of law for indigenous peoples. And many people say, well, they are no longer indigenous. They use our clothes, They use our cell phones and so forth. And one of these days, my daughter, who is a lawyer, gave an answer that I found very interesting. Regarding a colleague that came with that thing saying that they're no longer indigenous because they use things that Western society provides, or white society in our case. And she said, well, do you eat manioc? Do you like to eat manioc? She asked this person. Do you like to eat acai and that type of things? And the person said, okay, I understand. I understand. You know why? Because it's not because we eat acai. It's not because we eat bacuri or Brazil nuts or pama, abio, and guariúba, and so many other typical foods of the bush, because eating these things does not make us indigenous. So why would indigenous people become white just because they're lawyers? That is a biased way to deal with those of us who are radically different from us. And it's a good thing that they're radically different from us, because this means that we will be able to live with this other person that can teach us, that can transform us, that can educate us. But that relationship is not one-sided, it is two-sided. And the beauty of it is that we can learn from each other without anyone needing to cease being who they are. We can find each other, we can question each other, and we can deepen our differences so that each of us can continue in their respective directions. And I'm seeing Sydney Consuelo over there. I'm worried. Oh, there you are. Right, I can't see that well anymore, unfortunately. But I feel very honored to have you here, because you inspired this government a lot with your lessons. You gave an interview to TV Cultura when somebody asked, is it really possible to disintrude indigenous lands? And he said, yes, because close to Echo 92 at the time of President Collor, that's how you answered, right? That was done in almost 2 months. And how many artisanal miners were there, illegal miners? 20,000, 30,000? So we've done it before. Why not do it again? And President Lula embraced this, and we entered the Yanomami indigenous land. And I would say that it's not being easy. Not easy at all. I can bring you some data. We placed a permanent base of IBAMA at the community of Paramiu with a steel chain in the river so that not a single mining barge can enter to mine anymore. They can only go out. Our airplane was shot. Our barge was attacked. And this work is being done by the federal police, by the federal highway police, by IBAMA. We're all working together, but it's very difficult because we have a mix of drug trafficking, weapons trafficking, all types of violence attacking the Yanomami peoples. And the work is very extensive because it's not just there, it's at Munduruku, it has to do with the Kayapos, it has to do with other indigenous communities that are being equally attacked by crime, by illegal mining, by all types of crime, in fact, as I mentioned. But in these first 3 months of the Lula administration, despite having IBAMA by our side, IBAMA, which when I left the government in 2008 had 2,000 inspectors, and that had 1,500 inspectors when Lula left the administration. 15 years later, I come back and I see there are only 700 inspectors of IBAMA left. The Bolsonaro government, when we speak of scorched earth, there was a dismantling of those institutions, and it is with those 700 inspectors that we are working. I'm happy to say that there is going to be a new public examination to hire new inspectors for IBAMA. But right now, what we have is very few. In the indigenous lands, we have 300, 200 right now. But even with that small number of inspectors, we have already been able to increase our seizures in comparison to the first 3 months of the Bolsonaro administration. We have been able to increase them by 133%. We have also increased embargoes by something like 93%. And the capacity of fining for wrongdoings has also increased by almost 300%. And that is the rule of law. The law in favor of the public interest of the state, and also to the benefit of those who don't want us to do what we're doing, because we are only an agricultural power because we are a water power. And we are a water power, as Sebastião Salgado said, because we are a forest power. The Amazon produces 20 billion tons of water per year. That turns into vapor, and it is launched into the atmosphere and becomes rain. 75% of South America's GDP goes through the waters produced by the Amazon. If you destroy the Amazon, we will turn something similar to the Sahara Desert. So, as Gilberto Gil says, the people know what they want, but they also want what they know. Because what's harder is what the people want, but they don't know that they want. Because we have a very strong opposition, people that are often very dangerous, such as those who are financing illegal mining. If you see those poor miners carrying their stuff through the forest, don't realize that there is an industry behind them, very rich people, the industry of crime financed by very powerful rich people. Because in Brazil, unfortunately, to sell gold, all you need to have is a declaration of good faith. And I'm happy to say also that Minister Haddad said that these times are almost over, because it will no longer be enough to declare that the gold was obtained in good faith. And the fact is that because the rule of law is not being applied appropriately in some areas, in the state of Roraima, that is the case, because they are mining there. And how is it being sold in international? This is happening by criminal laundering of what is stolen from Yanomami lands. And that's why to think of the democratic rule of law is to look to justice. When they judge the situation in Raposa Terra do Sol, when the decision was made to take vaccines to indigenous lands for them to be the first ones vaccinated, and when the decision was made to protect those that think differently from us and that live differently from us, but that, even so, complete us. Our deepest roots lie in having the understanding that, according to the democratic rule of law, Brazil can be an agricultural power, but also a forest power. A country that is a forest power and agricultural power, but also cultural power, with this great variety of languages and of ways of being in this world. So I am very grateful for this symposium. That is the first one. Congratulations, Justice Herman Benjamin. You always anticipate things. And I am very happy to see that we are entering a new time, because I'm certain that the biggest change we should do is not the one that's in the Constitution, but the one that's in our hearts. And it is at times of debates like this one that we can see that which is essential, the founding basis of what we need. And our deepest roots lie with our autochthonous peoples that, unfortunately, when Europeans arrived here, said they have no souls. And by saying they had no souls, ripped out the true soul of the civilization they wanted to found. So with those words, I want to say that what we want is a democratic rule of law that has a soul, where justice and artists meet in the same table. Thank you.
Eu agradeço.
I wish to thank Minister Marina Silva, and all of us attending this event have clearly noticed that you spoke from the bottom of your heart and from the bottom of your soul, and you did so poetically. And your words illustrate to us all the everyday reality and experience of the indigenous peoples. Your words also remind us of our responsibility in this world. All of us are ultimately responsible for the Amazonian region. All of us are responsible for ensuring that the traditions of original peoples be preserved, not only here at the judiciary, but also elsewhere in society at large. And we are keenly aware of our responsibility in that regard at the judiciary as well. I would like to call to mind, as mentioned by Minister Marina Silva, and also since Dr. Joanne had to leave earlier, she left with me a request, the request to remind you all that when on July 8, 2022, Law 4422 came into effect, the term Indio in Portuguese is no longer used, and the wording has been changed to Indigenous Peoples and not Indians or Indigenous only. It's always important to bear that in mind, because it's part of our culture. People usually refer to Indigenous peoples by using the term Indio in Portuguese, whereas today it is no longer recommended. We rather now use Indigenous peoples. At this point, I'd like to hand over to Minister Marina Silva, your certificate of attendance. Thank you so much for participating in this panel session, and thank you so much for your lessons, your teachings, and also for your very candid heart and also tender words. Thank you again. Ladies and gentlemen, you are all invited to the opening of the photography exhibition Indigenous Peoples, Nature and Justice by photographer Sebastião Salgado, to be held in a few minutes at the upper floor in the plenary building. Make sure you do use your badges for access to the building. We would also like to ask foreign participants who have used simultaneous interpretation devices to please return the equipment where you picked them up at the beginning of the event. There's also an area allocated for the virtual presentation of a movie as courtesy by the Embassy of Norway, an interfaith initiative by Pindorama Filmes movie company, a 10-minute video clip, script and direction by Estevão Ciabata, narration by tribal chief Raquel Tupinambá. It provides an immersive experience in the heartland of the Amazonian region. And this International Symposium, Indigenous Peoples, Nature and Justice, will continue tomorrow, Tuesday, as of 9 o'clock in this auditorium. Again, we will be seeing you tomorrow. Good evening, everyone. The interpreters remind...
Organizar as contas é tão mais fácil com Minhas Finanças. Como eles pensaram nisso? Como que a gente pode dar mais ferramentas para quem tá lá usando o app do bebê?
Já sei. E se desse para organizar os gastos por categorias? Tipo, gasto com pizza?
Isso! E ainda ver os extratos de todos os bancos num só lugar.
Genial! A gente criou o Minhas Finanças para você descobrir como é fácil organizar sua vida. Descubra o Minhas Finanças no app do bebê.
A cultura é capaz de transformar vidas. É prática que ecoa cidadania, inclusão, democracia. É potência criativa que faz pensar, agir e se orgulhar. A cultura é motor que faz crescer a economia e fortalecer o social. É espelho de um Brasil vivo e diverso. É manifestação que não se pode deixar de alimentar. É com essa convicção e ciente de que cultura também é um direito constitucional que o governo federal lança o Decreto de Fomento à Cultura, que vai garantir maior eficiência na gestão cultural. A partir de agora, o fomento será adaptado à lógica dos projetos culturais, ganhando maior eficiência e transparência na administração dos recursos públicos, o que é bom para os artistas e agentes, para a gestão governamental e para os brasileiros que têm garantido seu direito à cultura. Uma iniciativa que vai apoiar e valorizar a cultura e a arte brasileiras, com mais democratização, descentralização e diversidade, fazendo com que as leis Rouanet, Paulo Gustavo e Aldir Blanc contribuam cada vez mais para o resgate dos nossos valores e da nossa identidade. É o reconhecimento para quem trabalha e vive pela arte, ajudando a fazer um país melhor. Brasil, União e Reconstrução. Governo Federal.